Marcus had stopped counting days after the third week. Time aboard the ship moved differently. No sun to rise or set, only the constant ambient light that adjusted to some algorithm monitoring his circadian rhythms. He'd been a civil engineer before the light came, before the paralysis, before waking in a space designed to approximate his apartment with unsettling accuracy, but missing every detail that mattered. The enclosure contained a bed, a table, a chair. Basic facilities hidden behind a partition that offered the illusion of privacy. Everything was clean, temperature perfect, slightly wrong. The walls were some material he couldn't identify. Not metal, not plastic. Something that seemed to absorb sound and redistribute it as silence. He'd spent the first days testing boundaries, walking the perimeter, searching for seams, controls, weaknesses. There were none he could find. The others he'd glimpsed through transparent sections during what might have been transport. People in similar enclosures, faces pressed against barriers that wouldn't yield, had eventually settled into patterns too. Survival required adaptation. The human mind demanded routine even in captivity. Marcus created structure, morning exercises, mental calculations of load-bearing ratios and stress distributions to keep his mind sharp. Afternoons spent observing the subtle changes in light that suggested something beyond his walls monitoring. Recording, cataloging. Evening reserved for stillness, for not thinking about Earth, about whether it still existed, about who might be searching for him, or if the world had simply continued without pause. The visitors came at intervals. Tall figures moving with liquid grace, their forms visible through sections of wall that became transparent without warning. They watched him the way he'd once watched construction sites, assessing, measuring, noting deviations from expected parameters. He was infrastructure now, a specimen of human engineering to be studied and understood. One came more frequently than others, taller than most, with skin that caught light like brushed silver and eyes that shifted through colors he had no names for. Marcus began to recognize patterns in this one's observations. The slight tilt of the head when Marcus did something unexpected, the way it stood closer to the barrier than protocol seemed to dictate, the duration of its visits gradually lengthening. Marcus named it Sci-HFY. The name meant nothing, was nothing, but giving it language created distance from the fact that he was property, a pet in an alien's collection. Sci-HFY began staying longer, sometimes for what felt like hours, just watching. Marcus continued his routines, performing his humanity like a trained animal, hating himself for adapting, hating himself more for the small relief he felt when Sci-HFY arrived. The watching had become companionship by default, the only consistent presence in an existence stripped of everything else. The first time Sci-HFY entered the enclosure, Marcus's body went rigid. Every instinct screamed flight, but there was nowhere to go. The barrier had simply ceased to exist, and Sci-HFY stood in the space that had been his entire world, impossibly tall, skin reflecting the ambient light in ways that hurt to look at directly. Sci-HFY moved with deliberate slowness, each gesture measured. It approached the way someone might approach a wild animal, cautious, respectful of the capacity for fear. One long-fingered hand extended, palm facing Marcus in what might have been a gesture of peace or simply curiosity about human anatomy. Marcus held still, his heart hammered against his ribs, blood loud in his ears. Sci-HFY's hand came closer, and Marcus forced himself not to flinch when cool fingers pressed against his chest. The touch was clinical, purposeful, measuring his heartbeat, documenting his fear response, cataloging another data point in whatever study justified his captivity. But the hand lingered, a fraction of a second beyond what measurement required. And in that fraction, Marcus felt his heartbeat shift, not slowing, but changing rhythm. Not fear anymore, but something more complicated, something that made his skin feel too tight and his breathing shallow. Sci-HFY's eyes widened, pupils contracted to pinpoints, then dilated again. The hand withdrew, but slowly, fingertips trailing across fabric, leaving a line of awareness across Marcus's chest that he felt long after Sci-HFY had gone. The visits changed after that. Sci-HFY began bringing objects, showing them to Marcus, observing his reactions. A piece of what might have been fruit from their world, translucent and geometric. A tool whose purpose Marcus couldn't fathom. a material that shifted texture under touch, changing from solid to liquid to something between. Marcus responded in kind. When Sale placed something in his hands, Marcus demonstrated its properties, explored it, showed by action what words couldn't convey. He began to read Sale's reactions, the subtle shift in posture that meant interest, the way the alien's breathing changed when Marcus did something unexpected, the faint color that rose beneath that silver skin when their hands touched during exchanges. They were building vocabulary, not of words but of presence, of proximity, of small revelations about how each experienced existence. Marcus learned that Sale was sensitive to pressure, that light touches along the forearm produced visible ripples beneath the skin. Sale discovered that Marcus's neck flushed when core temperature rose, that his pupils dilated when processing complex information, that certain textures made him smile without conscious intent. The watching became interaction. The interaction became something that felt dangerously like communication, and beneath it all, a current Marcus didn't have words for. Awareness of bodies in shared space, of breath synchronized during careful exchanges, of the heat his skin generated, and how Sale seemed drawn to it, standing closer than strictly necessary, presence steady and increasingly familiar. Marcus discovered the viewing port during his 6th week. A section of wall that became transparent when touched in a specific sequence, whether by design or accident, he couldn't tell. Through it, he could see other enclosures, other humans moving through their own routines. Some paced endlessly, some sat motionless for hours, some screamed at barriers that wouldn't respond. He also saw the ship's interior spaces. Vast corridors empty of decoration, chambers where the visitors gathered in groups, their movements choreographed in patterns that suggested ritual or governance. Everything was efficient, minimal, designed for function rather than comfort. It was architecture without joy, engineering without soul, perfect sterile dead. Sale found him at the viewport one afternoon watching the other humans. The alien's reflection appeared in the transparent surface before Marcus heard the barrier dissolve. They stood side by side, both observing, neither touching. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of awareness, of proximity, of shared focus, of something building between them that neither could name. Sale's hand rose, pointing to one of the visible humans, then gestured a question Marcus had learned to recognize. Why? What does this mean? How do you explain this behavior? Marcus tried to answer without words. He touched his own chest, then gestured to the other humans, then to Sale. Separation, isolation, the human need for connection. He didn't know if Sale understood. Alien expressions were difficult to pass, colors shifting beneath skin in patterns Marcus couldn't decode. But Sale moved closer, close enough that Marcus could feel the temperature difference. Sale's body ran cooler than human, but not cold. Close enough to sense the alien's breathing, a rhythm slightly slower than his own. Close enough that when Sale's arm brushed against his, the contact felt deliberate. They stood that way for a long time. Two beings watching others of Marcus's kind, isolated by circumstance and design, while between them something grew that violated every protocol of captivity. Marcus felt the warmth of his own skin against Sale's coolness, felt his pulse settling into rhythm with Sale's breathing, felt the dangerous comfort of presence. When Sale finally moved away, one long finger traced down Marcus's arm before breaking contact. The touch was brief, gentle, unnecessary. Marcus's skin remembered it for hours afterward. Sale began teaching Marcus about the ship. Through gesture and demonstration, through interfaces that responded to touch, through careful observation of Marcus's comprehension. The visitor's civilization operated on principles of absolute consensus. Decisions reached through cycles of deliberation that sometimes lasted weeks. Violence was impossible for them, bred out millennia ago, replaced by protocols and equilibrium-seeking algorithms that governed every interaction. But beneath that order, Marcus sensed fractures. Not all visitors agreed on the human specimen's purpose. Some saw them as biological resources to be analyzed and utilized. Others viewed them as contamination, dangerous in their vitality, threatening to the careful balance their society maintained. And a small faction, Sale among them, seemed to see something else entirely. Not resources, not threats. Something that made them spend hours watching human behavior, with what looked increasingly like longing. Marcus learned about the fade, the slow death of biological drives that had been consuming their species for generations. They had extended their lives, perfected their technologies, achieved harmony with their environment, and in doing so had optimized away the messy, irrational impulses that made existence more than mere continuation. Reproduction required clinical intervention. Desire was theoretical. Connection had become unnecessary when consensus eliminated conflict. They had crossed galaxies seeking what they'd lost, and they'd found it in humans, beings who still fought, hungered, wanted with intensity that bordered on violence. Dangerous, fascinating, incomprehensible. Marcus stood before an interface displaying data streams he couldn't read, Sale beside him explaining something through gestures that suggested synthesis, extraction, distillation. The implication was clear enough. They wanted to bottle human vitality, to reproduce it chemically, to reignite their fading drives without the complication of dealing with actual human messiness. Sale's hand settled on Marcus's shoulder as Data scrolled past. The weight was light but definite, thumb resting against the side of his neck where pulse beat visible. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, felt Sale's fingers press incrementally firmer, measuring that response. But the gesture wasn't clinical anymore, it was grounding, anchoring, almost protective. Marcus turned his head slightly, enough to meet Sale's gaze. Those impossible eyes watched him with something approaching concern, colors shifting beneath the surface like thoughts made visible. What are you, Marcus wondered. What am I to you? Sale's thumb moved against his neck in what might have been answer. A small stroke across skin, there and gone, leaving Marcus's pulse hammering and his breathing uneven. They stood that way for a long moment, Data scrolling past unregarded, two bodies in space learning to communicate without language, finding vocabulary in touch and proximity and the way temperature equalized between them. The night, if darkness could be called night, that everything shifted, Marcus woke to find Sale in his enclosure, not observing from beyond the barrier. Inside, standing beside his bed, watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. He sat up slowly, blanket falling away. Sale didn't move. The alien's chest rose and fell with breathing that seemed faster than usual, colors pulsing beneath skin in patterns Marcus had never seen. Fear? Agitation? Something else entirely? Sale's hand extended, not measuring this time, offering. Marcus stared at it, at the long fingers that had catalogued every aspect of his biology, that had learned to communicate through careful touches, that trembled now with something that looked like need. He took the offered hand. Sale's fingers closed around his, cool against his warmth, and Marcus felt the alien's pulse through contact points, rapid, irregular, nothing like the calm that usually characterized their interactions. Sale drew him up, and they stood facing each other in the dim light, still holding hands, neither moving to break contact. Sale's free hand rose to Marcus's face. Fingertips traced his jawline, the angle of his cheekbone, the curve of his ear. Exploration, but not clinical, personal, intimate. Marcus held still, barely breathing, while Sale mapped the architecture of his face with touch that felt like wonder. When Sale's thumb brushed across his lower lip, Marcus's breath shuddered out. The alien's eyes tracked the response, pupils dilating. Sale's hand slid into his hair, fingers carding through the texture, and Marcus's eyes closed despite himself. How long since he'd been touched with something approaching tenderness? How long since touch meant anything but measurement? He reached out, let his hand settle against Sale's chest, felt the alien's breathing hitch, felt temperature differences through thin fabric, felt the rapid pulse that suggested Sale was as affected as he was. This was dangerous. This violated every boundary between captor and captive, observer and specimen. This changed everything. Sale's forehead came to rest against his. Not a kiss, their physiologies were too different, but contact, closeness, breath mingling in the space between them. Marcus felt Sale's hand tighten in his hair, felt the alien's other hand slide around his waist, drawing them together until no space remained between them, until he could feel Sale's heartbeat against his chest, rapid and insistent, mirroring his own. They stood that way until breathing synchronized, until racing pulses settled into rhythm, until the transgressive intimacy of the moment became something else. Not acceptance. Neither could accept what this meant, but acknowledgement. Recognition that something had shifted irreversibly between them. When Sale finally left, pulling away with visible reluctance, Marcus sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands. They were shaking. His whole body felt charged, hypersensitive, every nerve ending aware of where Sale had touched, where skin still carried the memory of contact. He'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, felt something he couldn't unfeel, and he wanted more. The other humans began to notice his changed status. During the brief moments when barriers became transparent, when they could see each other across corridors and chambers, Marcus felt their stares. Some looked hostile, others calculating. A few showed something like desperation, as if proximity to him might offer proximity to the visitors, might provide advantages in a situation where they had none. A woman in a nearby enclosure managed to communicate through gesture during one of these moments. "Who are you? What makes you special? Why does that one keep coming back?" Marcus had no answer. He was civil engineer from Seattle, 34 years old, no one extraordinary. No one who deserved to be singled out while others remained in pure isolation. The guilt sat heavy in his chest, made worse by the fact that he didn't want to give up what he had with Sale. Didn't want to return to pure captivity, to being just another specimen. Sale came more frequently now, sometimes multiple visits in what Marcus measured as a single day. The alien brought things, objects whose significance Marcus couldn't always pass, but the act of bringing them felt like offering, like Sale was trying to bridge the gap between them through gesture and gift. Marcus tried to reciprocate. He had nothing to give except himself, except demonstration of the things that made him human. He told stories through gesture and expression, showing Sale the motions of building structures, of shaping materials into forms that could withstand pressure and time. He tried to convey beauty through the way he moved, efficiency through economy of gesture, humor through reactions to Sale's increasingly elaborate attempts at human-style communication. And beneath every interaction ran current of physical awareness. The way Sale would find reasons to touch, adjusting Marcus's hand position during a demonstration, checking temperature by pressing a palm to his neck, studying the texture of his skin with focused intensity. The way Marcus learned to anticipate these touches, to lean into them, to find excuses to maintain contact longer than strictly necessary. They sat together one afternoon on the floor of Marcus's enclosure, backs against the wall, shoulders touching. Sale had brought something like a holographic display, showing what Marcus eventually understood were different locations on the ship. Other humans in their enclosures, visitors in their daily routines, and something else. Deliberation chambers where groups gathered, where decisions were being made. Sale's colors shifted, patterns Marcus had learned to associate with distress or concern. The alien's hand found his, lacing their fingers together, and Marcus felt the tremor in those long fingers. Whatever was being decided, it involved them, involved all the humans, and Sale was afraid. Marcus squeezed the alien's hand, drew it into his lap, covered it with both of his own, offering comfort without words, without understanding the specifics of what threatened them. Sale's head tilted toward him, came to rest against his shoulder, and Marcus felt the alien's breathing slow, felt the tension gradually leave that too thin frame. They sat that way until the light shifted toward evening's simulation, two beings from incompatible species finding comfort in proximity, in warmth, in the simple fact of not being alone. Marcus woke to chaos, alarms he couldn't hear but felt in his bones, vibrations through the floor suggesting movement throughout the ship. The barrier to his enclosure dissolved, and Sale rushed in, colors flashing in patterns that spoke of urgency, danger, fear. The alien grabbed his hand, pulled him into corridors he'd only glimpsed through viewports. Other humans were being moved too, herded by visitors whose postures suggested controlled panic. Marcus tried to get Sale's attention, tried to understand what was happening, but the alien was focused entirely on getting him somewhere specific. They ended up in a chamber larger than any Marcus had seen, circular with transparent sections showing stars beyond, with groups of visitors arranged in patterns that suggested hierarchy, a deliberation chamber, the place where decisions were made. And in the center, restrained by fields Marcus could see shimmer but not comprehend, were three humans, two men and a woman, all unconscious or sedated. Visitors surrounded them with equipment, with instruments that hummed and sparked with energy. Marcus's engineering background recognized as potentially lethal. Sale's hand tightened around his, almost painfully. The alien was trying to hide him, to position Marcus behind its larger frame, but other visitors had already noticed. Colors flashed between them. Communication Marcus couldn't pass except to understand it was argument, disagreement, conflict, that their consensus-driven society had no protocols to resolve peacefully. One of the visitors approached them. Taller than Sale, with skin that ran darker, patterns etched into the surface that suggested age or rank. It gestured at Marcus, at the restrained humans, at equipment arrayed around the chamber. Its colors shifted through patterns Sale physically recoiled from. Sale moved to stand completely between Marcus and the other visitor, posture rigid, colors flashing in rapid sequence. They were arguing about him, about the other humans, about whatever those three were about to undergo. Marcus understood with sudden sick clarity. Extraction, synthesis, the process Sale had shown him, distilling human vitality into compounds that could be administered to their dying species. And it required more than observation. It required raw material. It required consuming what made humans human, reducing them to biological components. The three in the center would be first, test subjects for a process that might save an entire species, or might prove futile. But either way, they wouldn't survive it intact. He felt Sale shaking, felt the alien's hand gripping his hard enough to bruise. Sale was trying to protect him, trying to argue for his preservation, making some case to the others that Marcus represented more value alive than reduced to chemistry. But the other visitor wasn't convinced. Its colors flashed final seeming patterns, and it reached for Marcus with clear intent. Sale physically blocked the movement, putting that thin frame between Marcus and everything that threatened him. The other visitor recoiled as if struck. Apparently, physical intervention violated protocols so fundamental that even suggesting it constituted transgression. The chamber erupted in flashing colors, visitors converging from all directions, surrounding them. Sale didn't move, didn't yield, stood between Marcus and consensus with visible defiance. And in that moment, Marcus understood what it cost. The alien's entire societal structure breaking down, everything Sale's species had built crumbling because of one impossible connection between beings who should have remained stranger to each other. They separated them. Marcus back to his enclosure, Sale taken somewhere else, other visitors maintaining barriers that wouldn't dissolve no matter how Marcus threw himself against them. He watched through transparent sections as the extraction began, as the three unconscious humans were subjected to procedures that made every engineer instinct in him scream wrongness. He couldn't see the details, couldn't tell if it worked, if they survived, if they remained themselves when it was finished. He could only see the aftermath. 3 bodies removed, equipment dismantled, visitors dispersing with colors that suggested satisfaction or resignation or something between. And Sale nowhere visible. Marcus spent days in pure isolation, no visitors, no observations, only the enclosure and his thoughts spiraling darker. Had they harvested Sale too? Punished the alien for interfering with consensus? Used them both as case studies in why human vitality was too dangerous, too contaminating to preserve? When the barrier finally dissolved, he expected strangers. Expected to be the next subject, to face extraction or termination or whatever consensus had determined. Instead, Sale stumbled through, colors muted, movements unsteady. The alien looked diminished, exhausted, like something fundamental had been drained away. Marcus caught Sale before the alien could fall, took that weight against him, lowered them both to the floor. Sale curled against his chest, trembling, colors flickering weakly. Marcus held on, one hand stroking down the alien's back, the other cradling Sale's head against his shoulder. "What did they do to you?" he whispered, knowing Sale couldn't understand words, only able to offer comfort through touch, through presence, through the warmth of his body that Sale had always seemed drawn to. Sale's hand found his chest, pressed flat over his heart, feeling it beat, measuring rhythm and strength. The alien's own heartbeat was too fast, fluttering against Marcus's ribs where their bodies pressed together. Sale was terrified, Marcus realized, not of Marcus, but for him. Whatever had happened during their separation, whatever deliberation had occurred, it threatened everything. Marcus tightened his hold, pressed his lips to Sale's forehead, in a gesture he knew the alien wouldn't interpret as a kiss, but might recognize as care. Sale's breathing gradually slowed, body settling against his, finding equilibrium in contact. They stayed that way for hours. Marcus shifted only to make them more comfortable, to adjust, so Sale wasn't bearing weight on joints that bent differently than human ones. The alien dozed against him, colors stabilizing to patterns Marcus associated with contentment, with safety. And Marcus kept watch, kept vigil, silently promising himself that whatever came next, he wouldn't let them face it alone. When Sale recovered enough to communicate, the alien showed Marcus what had happened during their separation. Through the holographic interface, through gesture and expression, through colors that Marcus had learned to read like emotional language, the extraction had been successful. The three humans had survived, though whether they remained fully themselves was unclear. The compounds derived from their biology showed promise for reversing the fade, for reigniting dormant drives in visitors willing to undergo treatment. But the process required more than what those three could provide. It required scale. It required systematization. The debate in consensus had fractured their society in unprecedented ways. Some argued for converting all human specimens to resources, the most efficient path to species survival. Others, horrified by the implications, advocated for immediate return of all humans to Earth's quarantine, preserving them but sealing their world permanently. A third faction, smallest but most vocal, suggested something never before attempted: genuine exchange. Not captivity, but coexistence. Learning from humans rather than harvesting them. Sale belonged to that third group, and had testified before the full council. The alien showed Marcus recordings of the testimony, Sale standing before assembled leadership, using Marcus as evidence, demonstrating the communication they'd built, the complexity of human emotion and adaptation, the capacity for connection across species boundaries. And then, in apparent violation of every protocol, Sale had brought Marcus himself before the council. Marcus watched his own image in the recording, saw himself standing beside Sale with visible uncertainty, saw the alien take his hand in front of hundreds of observers, saw the ripple of shock that gesture produced. Because in their society, touch was clinical, purposeful, measured. Touch laden with emotion was primitive, base, something they'd evolved beyond. But Sale had stood there holding his hand, colors declaring what words couldn't, that this human mattered, that the connection between them was real, that desire and respect had become inseparable, and in doing so had shown the assembled council exactly what they'd lost to the fade. "You did this for me?" Marcus asked, knowing Sale couldn't understand, but needing to voice it. "You put yourself at risk for me." Sale's hand came to rest against his face, cupping his jaw, thumb stroking across his cheekbone. The alien's eyes held his with intensity that needed no translation. "Yes, for you, because what we have is worth the risk." Marcus turned his face into that palm, pressed his lips against Sale's wrist where pulse beat rapid and visible. Not a kiss exactly, but acknowledgement, gratitude. His own declaration that whatever happened next, he was committed to facing it together. The council's decision took weeks to reach. During that time, Marcus and Sale existed in suspended moment, not quite captive and guard anymore, not quite equals, something undefined and unprecedented. Other humans remained in their enclosures, but Marcus was granted freedom of certain sections of the ship. Always with Sale, always under observation, but no longer imprisoned. He learned about their world. The dying planet they'd left behind, atmosphere failing, star cooling, everything optimized to the point of sterility. He saw their art, if it could be called that, efficiency elevated to aesthetic principle, beauty found in perfect function. He witnessed their daily life, movements choreographed by consensus, conflict eliminated by millennia of breeding and conditioning, and he saw how they watched him, not just as specimen anymore, but as phenomenon. The way he moved with inefficient grace, the way his expressions shifted moment to moment, the way he sought Sale's presence constantly. They were studying human attachment behavior in real time, seeing what their own species had sacrificed for harmony. Marcus found himself performing humanity deliberately now, laughing at Sayle's awkward attempts to mimic human gestures, getting frustrated when communication failed and showing that frustration openly, seeking physical contact whenever possible, taking Sayle's hand, leaning against the alien during long observations, finding excuses to maintain touch. And Sayle responded. The alien's colors became more expressive, patterns emerging that Marcus recognized as corresponding to specific emotions. Joy when they successfully communicated something complex, frustration during misunderstandings, something that looked like yearning when circumstances forced them apart. Sayle was learning to feel openly again, reactivating systems that had atrophied in pursuit of equilibrium. One evening, if the lighting cycles could be called evening, they sat together in a viewing chamber overlooking the stars. Sayle's head rested against Marcus's shoulder, his arm around the alien's waist, their breathing synchronized. Comfortable silence between them, the kind that came from deep familiarity. Sayle shifted, turning to face him fully. Long fingers traced his features with the careful attention Marcus had come to crave. Across his forehead, down his nose, along his jaw. Marcus held still, letting himself be explored, mapped, memorized. When Sayle's fingers found his lips again, Marcus kissed them. Gentle pressure, deliberate intent. Sayle's eyes widened, colors flaring bright. The alien's other hand came up to join the first, framing Marcus's face, and Sayle leaned in until their foreheads touched, breath mingling in the space between them. "I don't know what we are," Marcus whispered against Sayle's skin. "I don't know if what I feel is real or just survival instinct. I don't know if you can feel anything like what I feel, but I know I don't want to lose this." "Don't want to lose you." Sayle's answer came in the form of touch, hands sliding into his hair, body pressing closer, heartbeat racing against his chest. Not understanding words, but understanding meaning. Understanding that what existed between them transcended language, transcended species, transcended the categories either of their kinds had for defining connection. They held each other while stars wheeled past, two beings finding something neither had known they needed, building between them a bridge across impossible distance. The council convened for final deliberation. Marcus stood before them again, Sayle beside him, hundreds of visitors arranged in their careful hierarchies. The three humans who'd undergone extraction were present too, standing under guard, their faces showing something broken that turned Marcus's stomach. The deliberation proceeded in colors and gestures Marcus couldn't follow. Sayle translated what could be translated through touch, squeezing his hand when positions aligned with their survival, trembling when arguments turned toward systematic extraction, colors flashing in patterns Marcus recognized as distress when the faction advocating for permanent Earth quarantine gained momentum, because all options carried cost. Harvesting humans preserved visitors at the expense of another species. Releasing them preserved humans but denied visitors their only chance at reversing the fade. Attempting coexistence risked contaminating visitor society with human chaos, human violence, human messy vitality that might destabilize everything they'd built. The deliberations stretched across hours. Marcus's legs ached from standing. His hand was numb from Sayle's grip. But he held position, held silent, let himself be examined by hundreds of eyes trying to determine if he represented salvation or threat. Finally, one of the eldest visitors approached them. The being moved slowly, with careful dignity, colors muted with age but patterns clear. It gestured at Marcus, at Sayle, at their joined hands, asked something that made every visitor in the chamber focus with intensity that felt physical. Sayle's colors flashed rapid sequence, answering, explaining, defending. The elder listened, head tilting, then reached out and touched Marcus's face. The gesture was clinical, brief, but when the ancient hand withdrew, Marcus saw something shift in those old eyes. Recognition, maybe, or memory of what their species had been before the fade. The elder addressed the assembly. Colors shifted across hundreds of bodies, patterns emerging that Sayle reacted to with visible relief. The alien's hand tightened around his, pulled him closer, and Marcus felt Sayle shaking. "What?" he whispered. "What did they decide?" Sayle turned to him, colors bright with something that looked like hope. The alien's free hand came up to cradle his face, and for the first time since they'd met, Sayle attempted human speech. The sounds were wrong, shaped by vocal anatomy, never meant for human language, but Marcus understood the intent. Stay. The decision wasn't simple release. The council determined that humans would remain on the ship, but not as captives, as participants in something unprecedented, an exchange program between species. Humans would teach visitors about emotional expression, about desire unmediated by protocols, about the messy vitality of biological imperatives. In return, visitors would share their technology, their knowledge, their carefully cultivated harmony. Not all humans accepted. Some demanded return to Earth immediately, unwilling to remain among the beings who'd abducted them, regardless of changed circumstances. Others saw opportunity, the chance to ensure humanity's survival by becoming essential to visitors rather than resources to be harvested. The three who'd undergone extraction said nothing, staring at nothing, whether from trauma or from fundamental changes Marcus couldn't determine. Marcus chose to stay. Not for humanity's sake, not for some abstract benefit, for Sale. Because what existed between them felt more real than anything he'd left behind on Earth, because the alien's touch had become necessary to him in ways that terrified and compelled him equally. They were given shared quarters, still confined to specific sections of the ship, but no longer separate, no longer observer and specimen. Marcus woke beside Sale now, fell asleep to the alien's cooler temperature beside him, spent days learning to navigate a life that fit neither of their species' templates. It was harder than captivity in some ways. Captivity had been simple: survive, adapt, wait for resolution. Partnership required negotiation, required constant translation between incompatible needs and expectations. Sale needed less sleep, processed food differently, found comfort in spaces that made Marcus feel exposed and vulnerable. Marcus needed privacy sometimes, needed warmth and weight, and textures Sale didn't naturally provide. But they learned. Marcus taught Sale about human need for enclosed spaces, for blankets and pillows, for doors that closed. Sale taught Marcus to find beauty in efficiency, to appreciate the spare elegance of visitor design, to understand that touch could mean different things depending on context and intent. They built routines together. Mornings, if the lighting cycles could be called that, spent in their quarters, pressed together under blankets Marcus had requested, Sale's cool skin against his warmth. Afternoons observing the ship's operations, Marcus's engineering knowledge finding application in understanding visitor systems, Sale explaining the logic behind designs that seemed counterintuitive. Evenings in viewing chambers watching stars, bodies fitted together in configurations they'd learned provided comfort for both. The other visitors watched them constantly, some with disapproval. Marcus could read colors well enough now to recognize disdain, disgust, the sense that what he and Sale shared was degrading to both. Others with curiosity so intense it felt invasive, cataloguing every touch and gesture for some purpose Marcus couldn't fathom. A few with something that looked like longing, as if witnessing their connection awakened something that the fade hadn't fully extinguished. And through it all, what existed between him and Sale deepened. The alien learned to read his moods by breath and posture. Marcus learned to interpret color shifts, to understand when Sale needed space versus when the alien craved proximity. They developed their own vocabulary, touches that meant comfort, positions that conveyed trust, silences that spoke more clearly than words. 6 months into the integration, measured in Earth time because Marcus insisted on maintaining some connection to his origin, the first visitor requested treatment. Not extraction-derived compounds, something else entirely. The visitor wanted what Marcus and Sale had, wanted to understand through experience rather than observation, wanted a human partner of their own. The request triggered new deliberation. Because partnering implied equality, implied genuine exchange rather than study, it required fundamentally reconceptualizing humanity's role aboard the ship. Not specimens, not even teachers exactly. Partners. Marcus found himself at the center of new debates. The visitor who'd requested treatment, a younger one, colors vibrant and shifting with obvious distress, approached him with Sale translating, asked questions that Sale struggled to convey. What does it mean? How do you know it's real? Is it worth the chaos it creates? Marcus couldn't answer with words the visitor would understand. He could only demonstrate, could only take Scile's hand, draw the alien close, let his actions speak. Show how Scile's presence grounded him, how the alien's touch calmed anxieties that captivity had carved deep. Show that what they'd built together felt more vital than any freedom he'd known before. The young visitor watched with intensity that made Marcus feel exposed. Watched as Sale leaned into him as they found equilibrium together, as something wordless passed between them that changed the very air. When the visitor left, colors were shifting in patterns Sale later explained meant determination, meant decision made despite risks. More visitors came, some seeking similar partnerships, others simply trying to understand. Each interaction forced Marcus to articulate something he'd only felt, what desire meant, what connection required, what it cost to choose another being's presence over comfortable solitude. And each conversation drove home how fragile their position remained. They existed in unprecedented space, neither of their species having frameworks to protect or define what they'd become. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, one visitor deciding their contamination outweighed their value, and everything could collapse. Sale felt it too. The alien's colors betrayed anxiety, patterns Marcus had learned to recognize as fear of loss. They held each other longer now, touches more desperate, as if trying to memorize each moment before it could be taken away. One night, wrapped together in their quarters, Sciel attempted more human words. Still wrong, still shaped by vocal anatomy never meant for the task, but meaning clear. Love you. Marcus's breath caught. He'd wondered if the concept translated, if what they had fit categories either species recognized. Hearing it, however clumsily pronounced, made something in his chest constrict. Love you too, he whispered against Sciel's forehead. Whatever that means across species, however it translates, I love you. Sciel's colors flared bright enough to illuminate their quarters, patterns cascading that Marcus understood meant joy, meant affirmation, meant a magnitude of emotion. Visitor physiology wasn't designed to express. The alien's hands framed his face and they stayed that way, foreheads touching, breathing synchronized, two beings acknowledging what existed between them despite impossibility. The shift came slowly, then all at once. More visitors requested human partners, more humans accepted, some genuinely drawn to the opportunity, others calculating advantages in being essential rather than expendable. Protocols emerged organically, guidelines for interaction that respected both species' needs. Parts of the ship were redesigned to accommodate human requirements, while humans adapted to visitor social structures. It wasn't harmony exactly. Both species remained fundamentally different, needs and instincts often incompatible. Conflicts arose, misunderstandings that couldn't be easily resolved, relationships that failed when curiosity faded, humans who couldn't adapt, and visitors who found the chaos overwhelming. But something was building. A hybrid culture, maybe. New patterns of behavior that fit neither template, ways of being together that created space for both efficiency and emotion, for both order and spontaneity. Marcus watched it unfold with mixture of pride and apprehension. He'd become symbol of sorts, the first, the proof of concept. But symbols were fragile, vulnerable to the weight of meaning others placed on them. He and Sciel had to maintain their relationship's integrity while being constantly observed, analyzed, cited as evidence in ongoing deliberations about humanity's future. The strain showed. Arguments between them about things neither could fully express, tensions emerging from the pressure of constant scrutiny, moments when Marcus wanted to flee to Earth's quarantine to escape the responsibility of being representative. Times when Sciel's colors went muted with exhaustion from navigating between their species' opposing demands. But they held together. When arguments escalated, they found ways back to each other through touch, through the vocabulary of presence they'd built across months of proximity. When pressure mounted, they retreated to their quarters, to the private space they'd made their own, wrapped around each other until the world beyond ceased to matter. And slowly something remarkable emerged, not just between them but throughout the ship. Visitors whose colors had been muted by the fade starting to show brighter patterns, humans finding purpose in unexpected places, building lives that transcended mere survival. A gradual organic transformation of both species through sustained contact. The Council eventually authorized limited return visits to Earth. Small groups of humans accompanied by visitor partners, demonstrating to humanity that their abducted people hadn't been destroyed, but had become bridges between worlds. The reactions were mixed: fear, anger, wonder, hope in varying degrees. Marcus returned once, stood on familiar streets that felt foreign now, spoke to family who looked at him like he'd become something they didn't recognize. Maybe he had. 6 months with Sale had changed him in ways that went deeper than adaptation. He thought differently now, felt differently, existed in space between human and visitor that fit neither category. When the shuttle returned to the ship, Sale was waiting. The alien's colors flashed with patterns Marcus now read as fluently as human expressions: relief, joy, need. He crossed to Sale immediately, let himself be pulled into an embrace that combined human and visitor greeting in ways that made sense only to them. Home, he said against Sale's shoulder, and meant it. Not Earth, not the ship exactly, but this, the space they'd created between them, the life they were building despite impossibility. Sale's answer came in tightened grip, in colors that cascaded bright and complex, in the way the alien's breath caught with something like relief. They stood that way while others disembarked, while both their species watched and tried to understand what they'd created. They didn't have answers for what came next. The integration remained precarious, dependent on continued willingness from both species to navigate discomfort and uncertainty. The fade hadn't been cured. At best, it had been stalled. Earth's quarantine remained in place, humanity's future still dependent on the ongoing experiment succeeding. But Marcus looked at Sale, at the being who'd seen him first as specimen, then as puzzle, then as something precious, and felt certainty about one thing. Whatever transformation was coming, whatever his species and Sale's became in proximity to each other, it would be worth the cost. Because what they'd found together, what they were building across impossible distance, felt like the thing both species had been seeking. Not equilibrium exactly, not harmony, but something richer, connection that didn't erase difference but made space for it, desire that included respect, love that transformed rather than consumed. They walked together into the ship's interior, Sale's hand warm in his, the alien's temperature rising slowly, adapting to proximity with human heat, and Marcus felt something settle in his chest. Not resolution, not ending, but beginning. The choice to stay, to build, to love despite uncertainty, to be transformed and transforming in return, to become something neither species had words for but both desperately needed.